Good afternoon. This is Dr. Tiffany Troso from The Empowered Patient. Thank you so much for joining us today again on our podcast. Today, I have the distinguished pleasure of interviewing Dr. Corinne Menn. Dr. Corinne Menn is an OBGYN who specializes in menopause, but more importantly, she is a fierce advocate for patients and for patient care. She has her own journey, which she's going to tell you about in terms of breast cancer, early menopause, and genetic risks. So she is a wonderful, wonderful guest today to tell us all about how she uses her own experience to help other patients in a very, very special way. Thank you so much, Corinne, for joining us today. And I'm just going to let you tell us a little bit about yourself, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. So yeah, I'm a board certified OBGYN and menopause specialist. I've been practicing for over 20 years, and I now focus exclusively on perimenopause, menopause, telehealth consults, as well as breast cancer and other female cancer survivorship, issues. And as you alluded to, also the hereditary cancer community, particularly BRCA previvors, so women who have not had cancer yet, but are dealing with a higher risk of cancer. So those are the areas of my passion for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, I mean, that is amazing. And as you know, we have a lot of overlap in the types of patients that we are taking care of. And I am so honored that you're coming onto this podcast, because if you ask me, you're like one of my role models. You're one of the people that I watch learning more and more about how to interface with the community and with patients and all the things that you're doing to help empower women. Tell me a little bit about more. Yeah,
I was saying, I don't come from the academic research background. And so I lean on physicians like you, specialists in, medical oncology and other areas. And I think right now what I see myself as is someone who has direct patient care, obviously a community-based physician, but also doctor as patient. And we'll get into, I'm a 23 plus year survivor of breast cancer. And I was diagnosed when I was only 28, when I was a second year OBGYN resident. So it was really my experience as a patient myself that I've taken with me. And it's been probably one of the best education that I've had was, being a patient myself. And so I think my strength is translating the information and educating patients so that they can partner with their own specialists, right? Because I'm not a specialist in everything, but I can help patients kind of think about how they can advocate for themselves so that they can get the best individualized care, which I know that's something that you're really passionate about too.
Absolutely. We're very much aligned in that manner. I do the same thing in terms of the cancer care, and I really try to meet the patient where they are so that they can really understand their treatment options, their disease, how to have other people help them, bring them into their sphere of assistance. And I think that the things that you're doing for patients right now is just remarkable. And it's really my passion to help promote physicians like you and like myself so that we can help people out there. So tell me, how did you get into the telehealth space?
So for many years, after first practicing full scope OBGYN, delivering babies and operating, I decided to kind of pivot and focus on office-based gynecology only, mainly because it worked better as like a working mom. Mm-hmm. And so I had for a number of years my own, office-based GYN practice. And then COVID hit, and I was still trying to help some of my patients because they weren't coming in for their annual GYN visits here in New York, during COVID, right? So I was helping them with some more specialty things. They wanted to, talk about perimenopause or menopause, or, they might have been newly diagnosed with a breast cancer. And so needed some help navigating. I'm like, wow, this telehealth works really well for the more nuanced conversations that really don't require a physical exam. We're really kind of talking patients through options, right? So that was the little silver lining of COVID. I discovered that, wow, this is a powerful outlet for me. And so then I never reopened the physical practice, and then got involved, met Anne Follenweider and Monica Molinar, who are the co-founders of Ally Women's Health, which is a women's telehealth platform where we care for, I'd say, more average menopausal women, So I spent a lot of time over the last bunch of years helping them build that. And I leveled up my licenses, and now I'm licensed in almost 30 states. So I provide telehealth care for perimenopause and menopause for the general woman, right? But then also I do a lot of education for both clinicians and patients in terms of the breast cancer survivorship space, because we've all heard the menopause revolution,
which you're part of.
Yeah, but it hit the public between like the New York Times and Oprah. You can't kind of get away from it. So what does that mean for people who are cancer survivors, who maybe had estrogen receptor, sensitive cancers or, more complicated medical conditions, they feel very left out of that conversation. And so that's where I'm also very passionate about making sure that we're lifting all of these very vulnerable women who are dealing with this. So whether it's from cancer or premature surgical menopause or premature menopause for some other medical reason, like an endometriosis or BRCA previvors. So so that's how I started to that's how I found my new mission.
I can feel your energy.
Yeah.
through the camera. I mean, I can tell, and obviously I know how passionate you are about it, but not knowing you personally quite as well, I can tell you that just hearing you speak about these things, how passionate and really heartfelt it all is. And that is so enlightening because at this day and age, having come from corporate academic medicine, a lot of us have, started to lose our fire. And
and it's not the doctor's fault. It's this total burnout of physicians, and it's completely unfair. And so when patients come to me and they're frustrated with, say, their medical oncologist or their OBGYN or whatever, I say, okay, listen, I'm going to play the devil's advocate and say, just like you're really upset that you only have 10 minutes with your medical oncologist or your GYN or whatever, they're really frustrated too. They walk in and they may have 30 plus patients on their panel that they need to see. And those patients each have really important things. And it's really hard to get into patient education and all the nuances of care and choices and shared decision-making and dealing with side effects and collateral damages of, say, cancer treatments in that little short time period. So they're frustrated. You're frustrated as the patient. So I think this is where it's really important that we leverage the ability of social media, telehealth, podcasts, books where we do patient education. And I know it frustrates doctors sometimes. Because I hear about it in doctor chat, things like on Facebook and stuff where they'll say oh my goodness, I've got all these patients coming at me, asking me about menopause all of this sudden, and they expect me to deal with this. And I'm like, well, yeah, patients are empowered, and it's frustrating in the current insurance-based model because we just don't have the time, right?
Right. Absolutely.
It's hard.
Absolutely. It's so important to have people like you, and hopefully my practice is developing in the space of helping patients interpret and understand what their oncologist is saying to them. Part of the beauty of what I've started to do is that I am not a threat to any other physician because I'm just here as a consultant. I'm just here, sort of the patient-physician go-between, sort of what you're saying, to explain what the doctor said versus what they meant, what your pathology report really says. And I think you're doing a lot of the same thing in terms of filling in those gaps, that huge need that we have to help patients really understand and participate in their care. I think it's a huge movement right now. I'm really excited about it. So tell me about a little bit more about what other things you like to do. I understand you do a lot of speaking as well.
So I'm super passionate about speaking to both patient audiences as well as clinicians. And I was really honored this past week. I got to go to the Miami Cancer Institute. They had a women's cancer symposium.
Oh, you were there.
It was the first time that I actually got to speak in front of the oncology professional world, because a lot of times I'm speaking with menopause specialists or OBGYNs, like people who come from training background, right? So it was really heartwarming and encouraging that, medical oncologists, breast surgeons, GYN oncs were interested in hearing about menopause. So I spoke kind of the issues around breast cancer survivorship and menopause. And then my colleague, Dr. Shiva Gafrani, which you'll have to have on the podcast, she spoke about GYN cancers and ovarian cancer and the intersection with menopause and how we manage that. And the big pink elephant in the room, hormones, can they take systemic hormones, local vaginal hormones? And if they can't, what do we need to recognize as menopause? Because I think the biggest kind of issue out there for all physicians, me included, for many years, it wasn't until I experienced menopause myself that it really woke me up, that it's a lot more than just hot flashes and some vaginal dryness, that the menopause transition affects you globally at every cell of your body. And, we have to kind of recognize that and just not just focus on those two things and be honest with patients about what long-term estrogen deprivation deprivation, long-term premature abrupt surgical menopause actually means, right? So I think that's really important, and that when we speak about this, and I opened up telling the kind of this oncology audience that like by speaking this, it doesn't mean that we have to say that estrogen therapy or giving back hormones is the only solution. But if we don't start with actually a basis of the understanding of the actual physiology of what is actually happening, because it's more than hot flashes, then we're all on the same page, and then we can talk about all of the strategies, you know? So I think that's really important. And they were really interested. So it was a really fun conversation.
So this was at the Miami Breast Cancer Conference?
So Baptist Medical Center has Miami Cancer Institute. It's one of the largest private cancer institutes in Florida, and they have an annual women's cancer symposium. So it was really great for me too, because I learned my colleagues, there was, medical oncologists talking about how to right size adjuvant endocrine therapy, people talking about the use of, circulating tumor DNA. I mean, there was all sorts of things also from the GYN onc side. So it was great because I learned a lot myself.
Well, did they tape your talk? Because I'd love to hear it.
I think they did. I will find out. Yeah.
It sounds like
good.
It was
and then it was interesting. Then the next day I transitioned to a more like general audience patient facing conference, and a friend, Jill Senemar, who's an OBGYN in Miami, she organized a conference for women.
Empower Her? Is that one?
Empower Her. And what was special about that was the recipient of the proceeds was BRCA Strong, so nonprofit organization for women who carry the mutation, who have not necessarily had cancer yet. And so that was really special, but also really eye-opening, because one of the women I met there, she had, a BRCA mutation was identified. She knew about it in her early 20s, and she took very proactive steps. And when she was in her very early 30s, 31, she decided to have a bilateral mastectomy with reconstruction, and she was done with her childbearing, already had her children, and she decided to have her ovaries removed, rightfully so. So at this point, she's 31 years old. Wow. She's now 42 years old, and she has severe osteoporosis. Nobody in Miami gave her HRT. And so this is a huge problem in the BRCA community, regardless of whether they've had mastectomies or not. These women are rightfully doing things to lower their risk, like having ovaries tubes removed, but it puts them into premature surgical menopause. And when you say you feel my passion, it's because I hear from literally now at this point, because of my Instagram account, thousands of women who have no contraindications for taking estrogen, and they're being denied it out of knee-jerk, fear-based ideas that like, ooh, estrogen and breast cancer, or I have a family history, or I carry a BRCA mutation, but I haven't had cancer yet. And even that population is being denied estrogen, much less talking about women who have invasive breast cancer, which is a more complicated conversation.
Right.
And so it was shocking to hear these stories. And she was in tears. Like, it's been 10 years. I've been miserable. I can't have sex. It led to the breakdown of my relationship. And now I have osteoporosis at 41 years old. It's medical malpractice, frankly. And I hate to be harsh when I say it, but if you remove, someone's source of their hormones prematurely and you don't address it, it's not okay. We don't do this to men. Do we chop off their testicles and tell them to see how it goes? See how you feel? Call me if you have problems. No, but that's what we do.
Right.
We do it routinely.
Right.
And
no, I agree.
Okay.
I agree.
So, yeah.
So,
I get mad.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, when I was in clinical practice, seeing the 30 patients a day sort of thing, part of my job, unfortunately, being a breast and, gynecological medical oncologist, was to put people into menopause on a regular basis. And that was part of what we did. Although I would dabble with the vaginal estrogen, we would use the vaginal estrogen inserts because we had data on that. And I would address the hot flashes, say with ancillary non-hormonal means, such as gabapentin, for example, clonidine if I had to. I also felt that it was my responsibility to manage the downstream effects of having no hormones. So I felt as an oncologist, if I put you into menopause, I'm going to follow your bone density. I'm going to follow your risk of dementia and all of those things. But it's a lot. It's a lot because that's not necessarily our focus in the oncology office.
You shouldn't have to.
Right.
I mean, reality is you shouldn't be expected to manage everything. But the problem is that your OBGYN colleagues and your internal medicine colleagues, primary care doctors, In a recent survey, less than 7% of them were surveyed said they don't feel fully competent in providing menopause care, prescribing hormone therapy, making recommendations, right? And that's in the general population. So the minute cancer enters the picture,
right,
the primary care doctors and the OBGYNs
eyes
glaze over. They're like, no. And then the poor medical oncologist who has to stay up to date on so many new things. At the breast cancer symposium I was at, the cancer symposium, it's astounding how many new individualized treatments are coming out every day, different protocols, different ways to address these patients. It's a lot to stay up on. And, you've got some patients who are really sick and you're dealing with a lot. So to ask you to also then suddenly become the menopause expert, that's actually not fair. So the problem is that there's a lack of specialty care in the system on whole. Agreed. And what really should happen is that all of these centers that are throwing women into prolonged surgical menopause or medical induced menopause, they should have a menopause specialist associated with the clinic so that you have that full deck of specialists. But that does not exist at literally any cancer center in our country. And if there's someone there, it's a sexual medicine, which I have to tell you, I really lose myself on this one. Most of the sexual medicine clinics at most of these cancer centers, they're very understaffed. And many of them are run by psychologists and nurse practitioners. God bless them. They do good care, but they don't have menopause specialists there. And frankly, a lot of the advice that I see coming out of those centers is really, really conservative, not progressive, not really up to date. I have to say, it's a huge problem. And the centers aren't giving those sexual care clinics enough resources that they need.
It's not giving anybody enough resources, for God's sake.
Yeah, so I feel like it puts medical oncologists in a rock and a hard place, and it's not fair. And so, the patient suffers, and I tell them, don't be mad at your medical oncologist. They literally have not been given the tools to be able, and they want to do the right thing, trust me. And so does the OBGYN, but we've all been lost without education on menopause.
Now, you have a course. Don't you have a course?
I do. I have a course. I have a couple of things. I have a course geared, a CME course for menopause specialists who want to really be prepared and understand how to approach a breast cancer survivor who's asking for systemic hormone therapy. And it's not this is yes for everybody, but it's not a no for everybody. So that course explores what the data says, what our non-hormonal options are. And yes, if you want to consider systemic hormone therapy, HRT, for someone who has had some form of breast cancer, how do you go about it? How do you review the literature? How do you do informed consent? How do you work with the medical oncologist? And we also talk about local vaginal hormones, right? The course is really designed for someone who's already a comfortable prescriber of menopausal hormone therapy. They know the ins and outs. What I'd really like to do is get together with colleagues to do a course geared for the people who aren't necessarily going to prescribe it, but need to understand menopausal hormone therapy. So a course for the medical oncologists, the breast surgeons, because they need to understand that data too, and how to do the nuances. Because what happens is patients get caught in the middle. They finally get to a point where they're making decisions about their body and deciding what they want to do for their menopause. And they actually might be an okay candidate. And we can go through some of those scenarios. But then they speak to their breast oncologist or medical oncologist, and they're like, their eyes glaze over. They're like, no, I don't know anything about this. I don't recommend it. We're not talking about this. Obviously not you. I know that you are very big picture, right? But many aren't, right? And so we need to stop talking in our little silos with just our menopause people. We need to break into the other specialties and be like, okay, guys, we've got 4 million survivors in the US alone of breast cancer. 300,000 plus are joining their ranks every year. We know breast cancer rates are rising, diagnosed even younger. So literally, we are going to have in the next 10 to 20 years, millions and millions of survivors, younger and younger, with better treatments, likely cured. And we're going to not address this. We're not going to we're going to just say no. Oh, we can't.
So how about for an OBGYN who's already in practice and, missed out on any minimal menopause teaching that they would have gotten during their training? What would you advise them to do to sort of help them bring themselves up to date?
Yeah. So it's super easy things would be The Menopause Society is the premier professional medical society that advocates and educates on the science of menopause and how to manage it. So I always tell them, start with the 2022 Menopause Society position statement on the use of hormone therapy. Right. It's just a great article. It's free. Anybody can download it. Patients can download it. That's a great starting point, right? There's a lot of, books out there now for the lay person, but I think doctors could also learn from them. And there's a lot of different doctors writing them, from Mary Claire Haver has got one. We've got Estrogen Matters. Dr. Heather Hirsch has a great one. There's a bunch out there. So that's like a fun way to kind of like get that information from a more like lay person way. The American College of OBGYN, the Green Journal, published a really beautiful review by Dr. Jim Simon and Dr. Barbara Levy. These are highly respected OBGYNs in medicine, and they've been part of medical research for years. They know the data very well. And they published a beautiful review article called The Contemporary Review of Hormone Therapy, because it needs to be contemporary. We have to stop quoting studies from 20 plus years ago without 100%. Context. Not that the large WHI study that many people hear, women talk about or doctors talk about was all bad, but I think actually most doctors who quote things from that have actually never read the study, don't actually know the nuances or what it means, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'd say those are two great articles that I would start with. And then it's pretty easy to find now online, easy CME courses, even short ones, just like a Menopause 101. And even if you decide in your practice you're not going to like specialize in menopause, I just think it's really important for us to admit as OBGYNs that our training did not give us adequate education. But
they're still not either, right? They're still
no, so like, yeah, so the survey, the data varies, but basically less than 20% of OBGYN residency programs have any dedicated curriculum to menopause education. And if they do, it's less than 4 hours. And in a recent survey, very recently, that they interviewed or they surveyed program directors and said, how do you feel about your menopause program? And the vast majority said, basically, they admitted it's poor. And it's not that they don't want to offer it. And the practice of medicine, the insurance-based model and all of that, like it's all about resources and getting funding and finding time to carve out to teach their residents. It's unacceptable that they're training physicians to take care of women for their full lifespan. And there's barely any education on the physiology and how we manage basically the part of life that women spend almost the largest part of their time in, and that is their menopausal years, right? So yes, something has to change. And as you and I both see it, it's coming from the ground up. So like women are hearing about it from that that's the other thing, the New York Times article from 2023, cover of the New York Times Magazine. So I really encourage all doctors to actually read this article, because then you can understand why your patients are angry and where they're coming from. It was called Women Have Been Misled on Menopause. There's FDA approved options to treat kind of the really bothersome symptoms that can be debilitating for women. It's been available for years. Most women aren't offered it. Why? And this is what this kind of viral article that really was a flashpoint, I'd say, in the public's understanding. That's a great place to start too, right?
Sure. So I'll make sure that I collect all of these articles and I'll put them down in the show notes for people to click on as well. So, all right. Well, listen, as I mentioned to you before we started, I'm sure that I could talk to you all day, because I find you're so knowledgeable and so interesting to hear. And I just love your passion. Any last words that you want to tell to A, to patients, or B, to colleagues out there in the trenches right now? What kind of advice would you give them?
I would just say, listen, menopause is a normal part of aging. If you're lucky enough to reach the age of natural menopause, great. It's natural, but you don't have to suffer with symptoms. And if you're going through menopause unnaturally, prematurely, surgically, or medically, we have to recognize that dealing with that is as important as dealing with the medical indication that got you there. There's great patient resources out there for cancer survivors. Menopauseandcancer.org is my absolute favorite resource for patients and clinicians. So if you're listening to this, please check that out, and that we can do better by women. And just ask yourself, if you're a doctor, if you had a son, if your husband or a man in your life, and not to be blunt, but if they had their testicles removed at age 35, could you imagine sending them off to expect to just live normally and have a normal sex life and deal with the consequences of that without really any help. But we do that to millions of women every single day. And it's a huge gender inequity in our education system and how we care for women. So we can do much better.
This is our generation's Title IX. This is
totally
bring it back up to level. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure, Corinne. Thank you so much for your time and all of your expertise. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure our guests will as well. I'll see you soon. I hope to have you back again. Thank you.
Anytime. Have a great day.